Yes, Father, if the Lord is that merciful, why should he just forgive all of you? I do not want to take the burden of my son. I forgive you. Brahma, please, Brahma said, he who repents before the sun rises from the west, Allah forgive him. That's the thing. So, if God is that merciful, why does he have to be forgiving, blood-sucking, bloodthirsty? Forgive me. Please forgive me. I mean, this is the concept I get from it. If it's that merciful, I forgive you all. I created you. I know your sin. I don't take the blood of my son, who is innocent. Gives me a body.
Well, yeah, I can only counter that by suggesting that we live in a world that we measure by temporal realities, by our experiences. Could God have made a world in which His mercy and forgiveness were made more manifest in such ways as it was a one-size-fits-all, one-time occurrence and everybody lived happily ever after? I suppose God could have, but that's not the world in which we live. Somehow, the grace of God is present and active, operative, in your world and in mine. As corrupt as so many dimensions of our world may be, as violent as so much of society can be, God is still here. God's grace is still working, and it makes itself manifest when people, when you and I and our children and our parents open ourselves up to that grace, and that's part of the beauty of it, to see the way that God is so present, not just in the words of the Holy Quran or the Holy Bible, not just 2,000 years ago in times of Jesus, Paul, Peter, or 3,000 years ago in the times of David, or in the times of the other prophets, or 1,400 years ago in the times of Muhammad. But God's present even now. And when we start to appreciate that, the way that presence can make itself known, if we only avail ourselves to God's grace, God's presence, God's will, if we submit ourselves to God's will, the power, the change, the transformation, the goodness that can become part of our reality. Somehow all of that seems to me to tie into that question of God's mercy and God's presence and God's designs at work throughout history.
We have not talked about the concept of anthropomorphism per se. We've talked about many other things. I mean, the issue of Jacob wrestling with God. Not just wrestling, but then defeating him. I mean, a concept like that. And the issue of God saying that because of what Eve did, He has caused all women of all time. I mean, what's your explanation for those?
The fall, the story that's part of the third chapter of the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures. I do not believe that is history. I believe that it's an attempt, an inspired attempt, and again, this notion of inspiration insists that God is behind the story, but that it's not necessarily intended to be a historical representation, but a mythical expression. Myth in its finest sense. Myth as an attempt to explain what is inexplicable. Myth in this sense, of trying to explain whence evil. Where does it come from? Why, if God, an all-good God, created this world, how did evil ever make its entry into it? And I think every religion has to struggle with the source of evil. And theodicy, you know, how does a good God allow evil to exist in the first place, much less become as dominant as it seems to be in so many circumstances? The story of Adam and Eve, I think, was a divinely inspired story rooted in a particular culture to try to answer a question which will never be answered satisfactorily until we all meet in God's kingdom, in Valhalla, in the garden, in the hereafter, wherever that is, however it manifests itself, and are able to bask in the wisdom, the richness, the truth of Allah. Until then, I think we're going to be telling stories and trying to unpack stories and explain what they mean and where they came from and how do we interpret, what are its implications.
Anthropomorphism?
Christians are guilty, big time, of anthropomorphism. We do it. We've always done it. And we know better. We ought to know better anyways. God is other. God is transcendent. God is, but God is also immanent. God is also closer than your neck vein. You know, God is present to us, and so how do we make that presence, yet that transcendence? How do we make it work? One of the ways of making it work is to ascribe to God human characteristics. Those characteristics that He talks and He walks and He molds with His hands, and it just makes God's immanence, His presence, that much more tangible. Yet anybody who uses that kind of language has to always acknowledge the transcendence and never forget that God is other.
There's a lot of talk about God being merciful and loving, and I always wondered, if heaven is real, why is believing in Jesus a requirement for getting into heaven as opposed to the acts that you did while you were alive?
The question, it's premised upon that ancient, not ancient, a medieval statement of the church that outside the church there is no salvation. Or also, I mean, even in the gospel is that same passage from John 3:16 talks about those who don't believe have already been condemned for not believing in the Son of God. I think those are statements, whether they're scriptural statements or they are doctrinal statements from the church over the ages, that are apologetic. Apologetic in the sense that they are meant to reinforce orthodox belief and orthodox structures as opposed to any other kind of thing. Do they capture the truth? Many of us would suggest no. I, for one, would be very comfortable in maintaining, even among my own brethren, that most of the people in this room are going to be in God's kingdom, whether we call that the garden or we call it heaven or whatever we call it, just as readily as many of the people that I acknowledge to be Christians will be. You know, and it is more a matter of how we live our lives, you know, how we submit ourselves to the will of God, than denominational affiliation. And so I know a number of very wonderful Muslims. And I believe there are many more than I know. And I know there are a bunch of very wonderful Catholics. And I know there are a bunch of very wonderful Buddhists. And there are good people throughout this world. And I don't think God is in the business of condemning people on the basis of denominational affiliation.
Let us give Father Phil a big round of applause.